Professor Woodwark, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And as I mentioned before, please nudge me if I can move the slides along, and if I do miss your cue.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. I really appreciate it. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to build on this discussion we've been talking about here. Hopefully, it makes sense. And my goal is to give you some information from the literature about the conditions under which we can achieve both the best performance and the best satisfaction in workplaces on these on the issues of how do we improve things, and to give you some tips on that I hope will help you in your process of working together as well, to come up with ideas and suggestions that you want to move forward. So I study thank you. That's great. That's perfect. Thank you. I study motivation in the workplace. That's basically what I do at the highest level. Specifically, I study employee engagement. And as many of you may know from your experience in the workplace, employee engagement is, it's a huge diversity. We have the research in both Canada and the US shows that we have about 25% of employees who are fully engaged in their work, meaning they're bringing all their energies and their abilities and their attention to their work, and they're just fully bringing themselves to work every day, each and every day. So that's about 25%. Then the research shows about 15% of people in the workplace are checked out. They're basically, as someone in the military once described it to me as retired on active duty. So they're showing up every day, but that's about it, right? So they're not contributing. They're not leaving, which relates to our exit discussion we just had. They're not leaving, but they're there. And then the balance, about 60%, are sort of in the middle. They're not fully engaged, they're not fully disengaged, they're kind of in the middle. So the engaged people have the highest levels of motivation, the disengaged people have the lowest levels of motivation, and everybody else is kind of in the middle. I'm guessing that that description of the distribution of engagement in organizations is not surprising to you. I suspect that resonates. Now, there are organizations who do a better job of that and organizations do a worse job of that, but across the board, that's what the average looks at. So one way of thinking about these stats on employee engagement is that the distributions that we see, fairly low levels of engagement, fairly high levels of disengagement, and a bunch of people who are sort of in the middle going, partly that distribution relates to how employees and organizations choose to respond to issues, problems, challenges within the organization. So we've been talking about the choices that workers have. Do they stay to deal with things or do they exit? So I want to just give you, as a way to introduce this subject, I want to give you a brief rundown of, this is a classic model by a researcher named Albert Hirschman called the exit voice loyalty model. So Albert Hirschman was, believe it or not, he was not a behavioral scientist in the way that I am. He was actually a political economist. But what he was interested in is, he was interested in how firms and people within firms respond to organizational decline. How do they respond to problems, issues, challenges in organizations when organizations were on the decline? And he was interested in that. He was wondering, so when things are going badly for organizations, how do individuals respond? When things are going badly for individuals, how do organizations respond? And he came up with this model to look at the choices that people have. So it's a 2x2. So the first dimension is to actively do something about it, to try to change or challenge the status quo. If there's a problem or an issue in the organization, well, let's do something about it. So that's the active part of the dimension. The bottom part, of course, is the opposite, is the passive dimension. People see an issue or a challenge within the organization and they don't do anything about it. So that's the first choice is, are you going to be active about it or are you going to be passive about it? The other dimension that he talks about is, if you're going to, are you going to respond in a way that's going to help resolve the issue ideally? So it's going to be to the benefit of the organization at the end of the day, or are you going to respond in a way that's going to be to the detriment of the organization. In other words, are you going to respond in a constructive manner within the workplace when there are challenges and issues, or are you going to respond in a destructive manner? So that's how he thought about it. Now, there's other ways to think about it, but I think this is a useful model, hopefully for you. It's a simple model for people. But essentially, we ended up with 4 different strategies that people can choose to pursue when they're looking, they're employees in an organization, they're looking at what do I do? So one is the active and destructive, meaning detrimental to the organization, is the exit choice, which we've just been talking about, right? People always have the choice to say enough is enough, I'm out of here, right? I'm exit. So that's a common one sometimes, and turnover is very associated with low levels of employee engagement and whatnot. The other 2 choices, so and one thing I want to note there is that when people leave, sometimes you don't know why they left. Some organizations do exit interviews and whatnot, and you actually find out why people left. But often it really is just a silent exit, and you never actually find out why people are leaving. The other 2 options, so one, the 2 passive options, the neglect option is when you just ignore, essentially you just ignore the issue, or you even deny that there is an issue. So the issue gets worse. It gets neglected over time, it builds up, gets worse and worse, so it becomes even more destructive for the firm. The loyalty option is when people they're not going to walk away from the issue, but they're also not going to take it on. They're basically recognizing that there is fundamentally an issue here that the organization needs to face, but they are going to wait it out. They're not going to step up and take it on or risk making suggestions or risk voicing their opinions about it. So essentially, they're going to leave the fixing to other people. It's not really destructive for the organization. It's not really constructive, but it doesn't become a barrier for the organization. That's a passive strategy. The big active strategy that is constructive for organizations is when employees choose to speak up. When they say, all right, this is an issue, this is the impact of the issue, we need to deal with this, here's some suggestions, here's some ideas, this is what I think, what do you think, and have discussions, active discussions about it. So this is the voice strategy. It's the speaking up and trying to fix and trying to challenge and trying to make things better. So there's actually 2 different kinds of voice that's recognized in organizations. One is called promotive voice, which is when you're trying to bring forward solutions, you're trying to bring forward ideas and whatnot that will help the organization, and you're trying to convince them to do things better. It's a persuasion tactic. That's promotive voice. Prohibitive voice is when people decide, okay, I need to speak up, but I need to force the organization to hear me. I need to, and that's things like grievances or lawsuits. It's essentially a strategy that says, you can't ignore this anymore. We are speaking up, and we're going to force you to change this. So 2 different kinds of voice. There's 2 different ways of doing voice. So notice, one thing I want to take away from this model is notice that only one of those choices of strategies that employees have to make actually is not silence. Exit, neglect, and loyalty all look silence all the time. You don't hear a lot of you don't hear anything from employees, so they all look alike. Voice is really the only one that overcomes that, and you actually get, and that's why the research is very clear that organizations that are good at getting employee voice, getting people to speak up, getting people to not choose these other strategies, those organizations tend to perform better. They tend to have much higher satisfaction than others. So before we move on, the only other thing I wanted to point out is that, and you've probably done this yourselves, the research shows that employees really make a calculated cost-benefit decision about which strategy they're going to pursue at any given point. So employees think about it. They think about, maybe my best option is to exit. Maybe my best option is to pretend this isn't an issue. Maybe I should just wait it out and see if somebody else will deal with it. Or maybe I should speak up, and maybe I should speak up this way, or maybe I should speak up that way. But they do a cost-benefit analysis of whether or not it's worth speaking up and choosing an active voice. Why? Because it's risky. So a lot of the times organizations do not want to know about the challenges and issues that they face. They just don't want to know. And so that's what the ostrich with the head in the sand is meant to convey, is that people in organizations often don't want to hear it. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with it. And so when you choose to speak up, you risk being labeled as a problem person. You risk retaliation. You could risk getting fired. Essentially, people often choose to shoot the messenger, which is the other graphic that I had there. So it is a risk when people choose to speak up. So I think that it's one thing to remember is that voice is very much an act of, it's an act of courage, and it's an act of risk taking. And that's why our next topic that I want to talk to you about is so important. So I'll get some, thank you very much. So when we're working in teams, either in organizations or in teams like you guys are working in for the next few months, psychological safety is a really, really important predictor of team satisfaction and team performance. So what is team psychological safety? So psychological safety is, in teams, is the shared belief that the team is a safe place for interpersonal risk-taking, like voice, like I just discussed, and expressing constructive dissent. And I'm sure you've had experiences where you've worked with teams where you had high psychological safety, where you felt like you could speak your mind and you weren't going to get trampled on, or you weren't going to be disrespected. And then you've probably, unfortunately, had experiences where you've been in teams or groups with low psychological safety, and you don't speak up as much because it's not a safe place for you to express what you're thinking and whatnot. So what I wanted to share with you is a little bit about what does a high psychological safety team look like? What are the behaviors and practices that they do? And what does a low psychological safety team look like? What does it look like? So high psychological teams, when the psychological safety is high in teams, people do behaviors like they're comfortable when they make a mistake. They admit that they make a mistake because it's safe to do that. They feel free to change their mind. They feel free to learn from failures. So if they haven't been able to express something well, or things haven't been going very clearly for them, they've been able to learn how to work through those things. High psychological safety teams, people participate without having to pull teeth, right? And overall, they do things like they ignore status differences within the group. They recognize that everybody has some contribution to be made. They make sure that leaders are people who manage process and not dictate content. They are teams that are highly cohesive, so they like hanging out together, they like spending time together. There's high levels of trust and respect. And trust is when you are willing to accept vulnerability in a group. You feel safe enough to accept vulnerability to somebody else or to other people. So high psychological safety teams work like that. Low psychological safety teams, on the other hand, they are ones where people are afraid to make mistakes. They start blaming others. People shut down and they don't talk. It's like pulling teeth trying to get people to speak up. Often only leaders are heard and no one else. No one's willing to challenge a leader. And one thing I thought was important for you guys to know is low psychological safety teams, they often succumb to what's called the common knowledge effect. And the common knowledge effect is when information or ideas that are widely shared amongst all the members of the team get the vast majority of discussion time and consideration and evaluation in a team. But just because it's a commonly held idea or piece of information beforehand does not mean that it's correct or that it's the best idea. So what can happen is you end up talking about things that you have in common in terms of ideas and beliefs without examining some of the lesser distributed ideas in the team that are actually even better ideas. So the common information effect is something that I think you need to be aware of. And basically you need to be aware of that groups tend to spend too little time discussing ideas or information that are unique to certain individuals, but not commonly dispersed throughout the team. So do pay attention to those unique ideas that are coming from one or two people, or information that is coming from other two, because that can be very important as well. So those are some of the differences between high psychological safety teams and low psychological safety teams. High psychological safety teams are very much predict of being higher performers and much more satisfied with the process. Okay, I just have a couple of, what I'd like to do is just close out before I get to your questions. I just have a couple of, we can move to the next slide, please. Just a couple of tips for thinking about your process going forward, in terms of how do you take what I'm telling you about the research on these processes and how you could apply it to your process and working together in your teams. So effective team practices are, so being aware of the common information effect. There are unique ideas and unique information in your group that you need to figure out. They're great, and you need to figure out how to get them out there, and you need to listen to one another. And just because you never heard this idea before does not mean that it's a bad idea or that it's wrong information. It means you need to make sure that you're sharing them and you're evaluating each and every one of them. I'm not sure what your leadership structure is in terms of working through this, but the research is very clear that the best role for leaders to play in this kind of process is to manage the process as a facilitator rather than to dictate content. As soon as leaders start dictating content, the quality of decision making and the participation tends to decline. So be very careful about leadership roles and making sure that it's always about managing the process and not content. So you know the old debate ideas, not people. I don't need to go into any more of that. Use brainstorming rules like suspending initial judgment when you're evaluating ideas and information. Truly consider all of the ideas before making a team judgment. Minimize status differences as much as you can. And then any ways in which you guys together can do some team bonding and build high levels of trust so that people feel safe enough to be vulnerable with one another in their communications. Those are the conditions that will help you be the most successful in your process to try to come up with the best ideas and the best, I think also the best experience for all of you. So that's what I have to say, and I'm really happy to answer any questions or clarify anything that wasn't clear for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Woodwark. And I just want to go ahead and invite some questions. Let me first just say that if you have any member has a comment or an observation that might be better for the entire group, feel free to put that into the chat. And if you have a question specifically that our presenter can answer, please do go ahead and raise your hand and ask that.
Okay, I see some questions here, some hands up. Can I go ahead or do you want to manage that, Richard?
No, I'll manage it for the sake of time. I saw Monique followed by Tracy come up. So why don't we let the two of them get started, and we have about 7 or 8 minutes for questions in total. Please go ahead, Monique.
Meredith, I thought your presentation was absolutely bang on. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thoroughly support and agree with your concept. I just totally enjoyed the whole thing. What you're saying is very true. As I was in a leadership role, I would twice a year have team retreats where we would discuss various things, how our department was run. And I would always accept feedback, and we would try to resolve issues as a team and try to develop ways on how to move forward in a very positive way. When I inherited that particular department, it was bleeding. So I was losing staff like you wouldn't believe. And so I was put in that department to stop the bleeding. And by using what you've described, myself, it made a world of difference. And as I said before, I had been brought in to a paramilitary organization, and my job was to manage public servants. So as you can imagine, the mentality was very, very different. And so they didn't feel as if they were being listened. But when I introduced what you described, it changed everything. So it does work, and you gain the trust of your employees, and you work much more cohesively as a team. And people appreciate that. So thank you very much for sharing that. It was awesome.
For sharing that your real life experience on this. I found when I was managing in healthcare before I became an academic, and these were, you learn strategies eventually that are effective, and I have found these strategies to be effective in that context. I've also found it to be effective in when I was a management consultant and working with external clients. I have yet to find a context in which I have not found these strategies effective. I'm sure they might exist, but I have found them generalizable so far. But thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right, let me go next to Tracy. And do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, do you think it's a strength of an employer to recognize the fact that not all employees are going to get along? And when you're doing these team building things, maybe it's better to not force people. I know a lot of the time I work in education and we're forced to these team building meetings and stuff, and sometimes just people don't get along.
Yeah, that's the personality conflicts and whatnot. So I think that employers have to be realistic that not everybody's going to be best friends on these things, but you have to decide to what extent do you feel that you have a responsibility to get along with people who are difficult to get along with in the workplace. But I think that in the employer's perspective, what is really critical is that the employers are very clear about what the values of the organizations are. What are the values? What is acceptable and what is unacceptable behavior? So things like showing up and giving it a good, giving it a try, doing an honest effort. You don't have to get along with everybody, but you can. I think employers have to be very clear about where the line is between acceptable and unacceptable behavior based on the values of the organization. So,
and I also think it's important, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Yeah. It's also important to recognize that not necessarily do you like everybody, but you have to be respectful.
Yes, exactly. So part of the benefits of employee voice is that you get all these ideas out there. It's like respecting diversity, right? There's difference of opinion, and you need to get all those ideas out there. You need to respect the whole of it. No one's going to ask you to agree with everything, but you do need to be respectful in the process. So I would say that that those are clear values that organizations have to communicate, and when they're not being upheld, they have to deal with it rather than just ignore it, because it just becomes, it just festers otherwise. And as soon as you allow people to, it's like dealing with kids or pets or whatever, as soon as you allow bad behavior, people see that and they see, hey, I can get away with this. If he can get away with this or she can get away with this, then everybody else can get away with this, and it tends to escalate. So I think being really clear about what are the values that are critical for this organization, that are core expectations, and working within that, recognizing that not everyone's going to love each other all the time, but they do have to be able to work together, and they do have to be respectful of one another.
Great, thank you. I'm going to let Fatima have the last question, but I also want to acknowledge that Mohammed and Dandy have put some good comments in the chat there as well for everyone's attention. And Fatima, let's turn to you and your question, please.
Hi, Ms. Woodwark. I'd like to preface this by saying I myself am quite interested in the study of psychology, and while I'm not an expert like you, by no means, I did a lot of readings and came to understand that studying the behaviors and actions of other people can serve as a blueprint of sorts for like what you can expect out of that person, especially in the workplace. So I was wondering if you have any like tips for how to conduct a brief psychological evaluation of your coworkers, and how you can use that to form better decisions on whether you should speak up or leave the workplace.
Okay. There are team building kind of processes where the outcome, the desired outcome, is actually getting to know the personalities and experiences of teammates better. So things like there are like personality assessment exercises and that sort of thing that you can do. I think what you're hinting at is more along like I'm not sure. I kind of got the impression you were thinking more like psychological evaluation, which is beyond the scope of my practice. But I think is what I think you're thinking more of, you know, like more of a formal evaluation like that. But I think that there are ways that you can, as teams and team members, find models and whatnot that can help you understand the personalities in your group, why they behave the way they do, why and how they can work together. So some of you might have the personality assessments that you can do, and sometimes they can give you really good insights into why people respond the way they do and why these two people don't get along, and it can help you see opportunities for people to choose to behave differently and to respond to people differently, so that you don't just reinforce existing problems.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Fatima and Professor Woodwark. Let me just thank you again on behalf of everyone for that wonderful presentation. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought around thinking about and being able to understand you know, organizational systems that promote voice, and how that can be incentivized, and how this assembly can lend its voice to asserting that, and certainly around promotive and prohibitive voice. Really interesting points. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday to address us.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.